Hey everybody. Well, welcome to our next video lecture content. This time, clearly we're talking about stress and sleep. And this area represents the third guaranteed thing that every person can do to help improve their stress response or to reduce their stress responses. We've talked about physical activity and we've talked about diet, and now sleep is those top three where we can clearly say that every single person, regardless of gender, age, ability, disability, whatever, um, each of these three practices are going to work to improve your level of stress, to reduce that and to reduce the impact on your body. Today, I've got three things that I would like you to be focused towards trying to be able to understand or give information back about by the end of this lecture. The first is, do you sleep the same all night long? Is our sleep consistent across the night? The second is, why is light and its source important to our sleep quality? And the last is, what actually is sleep deficiency? And what does it impact? So those are the top three things I would like you to get out of here. We're going to cover more than that, but those are the biggest. Question first, do you sleep the same all night? No, you don't. So we know that you run through four different stages of sleep. We categorize it in two different ways. We either talk about it as REM sleep or non-REM sleep. But of those two categories, then we put into four different stages. So this first stage that you see here, the non-REM stage one sleep, this is that lightest level of sleep. Sometimes people don't even recognize that they are sleeping at this particular stage. So it usually lasts 5 to 10 minutes or so is normal for people to transition from wakefulness to being asleep. But again, if you're feeling like, boy, it actually takes me like a half hour to fall asleep, it's very possible that you're actually entering into what would be clinically identified as non-REM stage one sleep, but just not even realizing that you're in that state. So it's a very hazy space between what you might think of as wakefulness and what you might traditionally think of as sleep. But clinically, we identify it as non-REM stage one sleep. Non-REM stage two, you can see we actually start seeing the body make some physiologic changes now. We're seeing the body temperature drop, heart rates are beginning to slow down. We're seeing brain waves shift. And this normally lasts in the range of about 20 minutes. From there, you move on into stage three, and now we're seeing some much more profound responses. And these are looking a lot more like that parasympathetic nervous system really taking over, right? Muscles are relaxing. This may be the initiation of when individuals start snoring as the muscles around the facial area relax and the jaw can slide back, restricting the airway and then thus creating the snoring sound as the airway is sort of vibrating as a person tries to breathe in and out. We're also seeing drops in blood pressure and our breathing rate. And this is our deepest level of sleep. This is where our recovery and repair of tissues is really happening. This is when growth hormone is being released at its highest point. So it's a really important stage of sleep for us to get to. In that fourth stage, then we get into our other categories. So far we've seen three stages that were all in that non-REM sleep. Now we get into that REM sleep. Now you'll notice the brain isn't getting less active, it's actually becoming much more active. So this is the stage when dreams are actually occurring. It clearly gets its name, that rapid eye movement type of sleep, because the eyes are moving. And we go through these phases of stage one, two, three, four repeatedly throughout the night. So you're normally going to go through between 3 and 5 cycles of these each night. And you can see that these first few cycles, where we're seeing more time within deep sleep, that means we're doing a lot more of our recovery in these spaces, in these hours of sleep that are taking place here. As you move towards when you're about to become more wakeful, you can see that our sleep cycles are pushing us into more and more REM sleep. So that's why when you wake up in the morning, if you're a person who remembers your dreams, you're much more likely to remember dreams um, early in the morning as you first wake up because you've been doing more dreaming at that particular space, that particular time of night. One of the things that sort of influences our body's biologic responses is something that we refer to as a circadian rhythm. So we actually have like kind of an internal body clock, and it controls a lot of the different processes that your body goes through, largely by the release of hormones at different times, or the increase of hormones and the decrease of hormones at different times that can help us to either feel much more alert and attentive or to make us feel much more drowsy and pushing us towards sleep. Your typical circadian rhythm is a 24-hour cycle, but not everybody's cycle is exactly the same. And it's really important or valuable to recognize that circadian rhythm or that daily cycle is really heavily influenced by the environment that you're in, the environmental cues that you're in. So light, which was one of the other things I wanted you to pay attention to, light is one of those primary signalers to our brain that lets us know what are wakeful hours and when it's dark, what are sleeping hours. So as we look in the future about trying to improve our own sleep quality and the conditions of our sleeping environment, light becomes a really powerful one. And you've probably heard lots more than you want, and you're going to get to hear it again because it's something I want you to be considering yet again. That blue light and our electronic devices can be powerfully unhelpful in sort of keeping us on a normal circadian rhythm. Turns out the average teen circadian rhythm looks a lot like this. So you can see here these time clock stamps where, and this may feel very familiar to you because you are still very close to this same cycle. Your energy really feels lowest in the morning. You may have a lot of trouble waking up. It may be really difficult for you to wake up or to attend early morning classes. Somewhere around that 10 to 1 o'clock, that middle of the day component, your energy is really elevating. But following normally, we eat lunch somewhere between that noon and 1 sort of hour. Your rhythms could be different, but many teens are going to have a sort of a slump. They're just going to feel a little more tired. You're not going to feel mentally as alert. And partly that's because of foods that we eat, and partly that's because of our diurnal rhythm. And then it may be very late at night before you start feeling any sense of real tiredness, that you feel any pressure to be falling asleep, that you feel any internal pressure to be falling asleep. So while the business world and the academic world may work off of a circadian rhythm, and adults typically work off a circadian rhythm that's shifted a bit differently, you can see some of the challenges with how your body wants to respond day by day around these sort of generic hour markers. Yet we also ask you potentially to be showing up to work at 7 or 8, or to be attending classes at 8. You may find it really difficult to handle some of our afternoon classes, that it's easier to get distracted, that it's harder to stay on focus. That's not uncommon. Um, and if you think about jet lag, that's a good example where circadian rhythm can be really thrown out of context. So especially if you think about like flying from Portland to Europe, that's a 10 to 14 hour flight, depending on where you're going, and a 9 hour, 9 to 10 hour change in time zones. So you can be leaving in the morning or in light in what your body interprets as daytime from Portland and arriving at what is actually midday of the next day or nighttime of the next day. And just be quite disoriented. So if you've ever experienced jet lag, you know that that can be a disorienting experience that can be difficult to deal with. Now, we said that that circadian rhythm can be driven largely by hormones. The environment triggers what hormones are released at different times. And there's a couple I wanted to bring back to your attention, two of which we've already talked about in the past. We've talked about adenosine when we talked about the stress response. And adenosine is going to just be building up throughout the day, and it just signals this shift towards being sleepy. As the accumulation of adenosine builds and builds, that's one of the triggers that influences whether you feel more and more tired or not. Melatonin is one that you've heard of outside of class, I imagine. And melatonin is a hormone that's released when you're in dark environments. So it's another of those things as the environmental cue of light decreases and it gets darker and darker, and it makes you just feel more sleepy and more drowsy. You might be experiencing that now as you think about it, as it's starting to get dark more like at 7 rather than at 10. 4 months ago, you may have been up and feeling quite energetic at 8:30 or 9 p.m. and you might be experiencing where at 7 or 7:30 you're starting to feel drowsy, and that's not because of changes in activity or because of changes in responsibilities, but because of changes in environmental cues. The other one that we have dealt with before was cortisol. So we've mentioned cortisol as being used in chronic stress situations. Remember, it really activated your body systems to just be really ready to go. So under normal functions, it's serving that same role, actually. So you see that cortisol is released when there is exposure to light, so when it is daytime, and it sort of naturally gets you ready to go. Awakens your body, or maybe awakens not the right word, prepares your body biologically to be able to do activity is a better way that I'd like to say that. So how much sleep are we supposed to get? We've all seen tables or data that looks a lot like this. As an adult, you are in that range of between 7 and 8 hours a day, which represents about a third of your time in a 24-hour cycle. But it's also a range, right? So how much sleep you need per day is really dependent upon you. You are an individual, and as an individual, your needs are going to be unique, but they're not going to be significantly different from that 7 to 8 hour a day range. So if you're not getting between those 7 and 8 hours, if you're not getting adequate amount of sleep for you, you're going to enter into what researchers refer to as sleep debt. So if, for example, if I'm sleeping 6 hours a night, but really my body needs 7 hours a night, that means I've lost an hour every single day. By the end of the week, my sleep debt is already up to 7 hours. Now it's really, really hard to make up for lost sleep. If you have the attitude that, well, I'm just going to sleep more during the weekend, even if you sleep in an extra 3 or 4 hours beyond what is normal, you're still looking at a debt of 3 to 4 hours across that week. And as that continues to accumulate from week to week, that sleep debt can be really, really challenging on your physiology and your mentality and your emotions and your relationships. Now, napping actually can produce some short-term benefits, but when we take naps, because we're really only entering into the two lighter areas of sleep, those first two non-REM, non-REM 2 stages, we're not getting into that deep sleep, the recovery sleep, and we're not getting into that REM sleep where our brain's really active. I didn't mention this before, but when we're in that REM sleep, that's when researchers really believe that you're doing a lot more of the coding and your brain's doing a lot more of the internal work to shift things from short-term memory to long-term memory. So if we're not getting to that stage 3 of non-REM and we're not getting to REM sleep, then we're missing out on the benefits of recovery, and we're missing out on the benefits of improved cognition and memory and those pieces. So napping can bring some short-term alertness boosts, but it's not a fix. It's not going to be fully reducing that sleep debt that you can build. So if we look across the United States about how many people are experiencing short sleep duration patterns, this is a graph of each of the counties in the United States. And the darker in color means the more sleep deprived they are. The lighter in color, the less sleep deprived they are. And you can see probably a lot of similarities in just the general patterning of this relative to when we looked at a very similar map around cardiovascular disease and when we looked at diabetes. There's a lot of common trends. And I think we can see that further as we look at data from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. So the US goes through looking at data trying to predict what are both modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors for different conditions, different disease states. So we can look here and we can see, I've got 4 listed here. Obesity and the definitions of them are listed as well, but I'm not going to cover them. You can see that obesity, physical inactivity, whether you're smoking or not, and whether you are consuming excess amounts of alcohol, each of these shows values that people who are not getting adequate amounts of sleep are more likely to experience these health risks than if they had experienced or if they were reporting correct amounts or sufficient amounts of sleep. So by not getting adequate amount of sleep, there is an interrelationship between different disease states and between different behavioral patterns as well. So I like to bring that up. I've talked about these 4 because when we looked, there was one specific condition that we looked at where these 4 um, variables were predictive of this one form of disease. So do you remember what that was? Where have we seen these risk factors is the way we talked about them. As we look here, cardiovascular disease is what you should have been identifying. And as you see here, both heart attack and coronary heart disease, which would both be categorized under cardiovascular disease. And you see other conditions that we've looked at, like stroke and cancer, and some others that are really important are on this list as well. What you will see here is that the prevalence of each condition is way higher for each person who's reporting short sleep patterns than for those who are reporting less sleep. So if you are getting less sleep, and that's the way you perceive your own experience, you're getting less sleep than you should. I shouldn't say that, not how you perceive your own experience. Let me erase that. If you are getting less than 7 hours of sleep, this was data driven off that BRFSS data. So if you're getting less than 7 hours of sleep, you can see that the prevalence of experiencing a heart attack has grown. The prevalence of experiencing coronary heart disease, of stroke, of asthma, right on down the list. Each one of these different disease states is actually higher if you're not, which makes sense when we think about that recoverative, regenerative, the recovery phase that sleep brings to our body. If we're not adequately recovering and we're not adequately healing, we're not adequately dealing with different diseases. The next of the things I really wanted you to pay attention to was around sleep deficiency and what is it and what impact does it have? So sleep deficiency is defined as having one or more of these 4 different things. Either you're sleep deprived, you just don't get enough sleep, or you're out of sync with that diurnal rhythm, with that circadian rhythm. Diurnal rhythm and circadian rhythm are 2 ways of essentially expressing the same thing. So if you're out of sync with that diurnal rhythm and you're just sleeping at the wrong time of the day, you're up all night, but your body wants to sleep during the day. That's a second criteria by which would sleep deficiency would be defined. If you don't sleep really very well, or you don't make it into all 4 phases of sleep, so you're taking lots of little naps, but you're not really getting into deep sleep. Or if you have some kind of sleep disorder that actually prevents you from getting enough sleep, or really impacts your quality of sleep. Any one or multiples of those four identify a person as being sleep deficient. And when we're sleep deficient, we've all been there at least temporarily at times. You recognize some of these things from your own personal experience. Your irritability, your shortness, your emotions are a little higher strung, your interpretation of signals and communication is clearly impacted. Your cognitive ability, both from a reasoning standpoint and a creativity standpoint, will be impacted. You may be forgetful and have memory losses as those sleep deficiencies grow or become more dominant. Then we can see impairment in moral judgment. The severe yawning sounds just delightful, but you can be experiencing things like that. And you can see further then if that sleep deficiency continues to be a part of your experience, then we start to see the body breaking down in different ways. And you can see those listed here, from immune system to the risk of heart disease, etc., and type 2 diabetes. So there's a lot of impacts that our body is going to have. I think probably the one that you recognize, at least in others more easily, if you have a roommate or if you have somebody that you are really familiar with, when they're sleep deprived, I think that irritability and that sort of short-term memory changes are the easiest for us to recognize, that there's just a mild cognitive impairment that can grow and grow if that sleep deficiency is allowed to persist. Now, you may think of yourself as having insomnia. Many people will talk about themselves as having insomnia. We're not here to diagnose whether you do or don't, but I can give you some information around that particular sleep disorder. So there's three basic attributes or three key attributes to identifying clinically whether a person has insomnia or not. The first is that they just have a lot of trouble getting to sleep or staying asleep. The second is that there's some kind of impact on their day-to-day interactions. It could be that emotional component, it could be that cognitive component. They're having trouble during the daytime because of this poor sleep quality. And the last of those categories there then you see is that it's not attributable to what's going on in their environment. And it's not attributable, you can't attribute it to them just not having the opportunity to sleep. So insomnia does happen much more higher prevalence in some populations. Older adults are much more likely to have insomnia. Women are more likely than men to have insomnia. There are some both medical and psychiatric conditions that are more likely to experience insomnia. Diabetes has a correlational relationship with insomnia, but I don't need us to list all of the different medical or psychiatric populations. But the one that maybe you've keyed in on is people who are under really high levels of stress are also more likely to be experiencing insomnia. So insomnia will be classified in two different ways, either as short-term or as chronic. Short-term just means that it's a state of sleep impairment that is lasting for up to 3 months, but it's terminating within that 3-month time frame. And that, if you look at it, and that's telling us that every day between 1/3 and half of people are likely to be sleep deprived to some extent, because this is impacting between 30 and 50% of people out there. Chronic insomnia is clinically identified once a person is experiencing these kinds of symptoms or these kinds of problems that's happening beyond that 3-month mark and is happening at least 3 times a week. Now, the number of people that are suffering under that condition is much lower, but that's also an incredibly significant component that goes into there. So, as we think about insomnia, or we look about insomnia, there's lots of big problems that are associated with insomnia. As you can imagine, just from talking about sleep deprivation, if we're extending that for long periods of time, there's really big challenges, both behavioral and health-wise, that take place. We can see increased rates of absenteeism at work and at school, that you're just missing commitments that you're supposed to be at and that you want to be at because they fit with your values. We can see a significant increase in motor vehicle accidents and for just mistakes at work, injuries at work. As a personal plea, I would really, really beg of you. We will be coming up at the end of the semester at Christmas break. You'll have come through a week worth of finals, a week prior to that that was probably crammed with all kinds of responsibilities, including studying and presentations and all kinds of things. You will have had a couple of weeks likely where you have tried to mitigate the responsibilities you have by reducing the amount of sleep that you've had. And then as soon as we get out of that last final, for many students, their natural inclination is, I just want to get home. I just want to get to the place. Um, I want to get home. And I just beg of you, if you are ever driving and you're feeling really drowsy and you're just feeling like you're not paying as good attention, you're not just mentally as alert and as clear, and you can feel your eyes just want to be getting heavier and heavier, please, please, please just pull over, take a 15-minute quick nap. It will raise your alertness. It will raise your ability to respond to the challenges that take place in driving and may save your life and may save the life of other people as well. So I really hope that just if you ever experience drowsiness while driving, that you'll be really thoughtful about that. You'll interact with that in a really positive way. Anyway, moving on from that personal plea, you can see some other components in there that chronic insomnia is really attributed to. That cardiovascular disease shows up there. Those short sleep cycles increase our risk for hypertension. But if you're just having trouble sleeping for a night or two, that doesn't mean you have insomnia. In many cases, it just means that you've either stayed up too late in a preceding time frame and your body's trying to reestablish that circadian rhythm, or you've woken up too many times, or you woke up in the middle of the night quite a bit. And stress by itself, as it impacts those hormones that we've talked about, stress is a common cause for a poor night's sleep. So there's some questions here on the slides that you can turn to if you're really concerned that maybe insomnia is something that you experience and you think maybe you should be seeing someone to diagnose that to be able to help with that more medically. These can be guiding questions. They're certainly not qualifying as a diagnosis. The last thing I want to bring to us for this particular lecture is a research study. So in this particular study, they were looking at sleep and how it interrelates with stress and how it relates to both mental health and athletic performance in student athletes. So they were looking at 190 D1 athletes, and you can see that they were looking at people from all kinds of different sports. So we had football players and gymnasts and volleyball players and divers and swimmers and softball players. And so there's a diverse group of athletes that were looked at here. What they were asking was they're trying to identify how sleep quality is associated with stress and with mental health. So they asked athletes about their sleep quality. They also asked them about their stress levels. They also asked them a number of other questions that pertain to both their mental health and their behavioral and performance. So out of that data, the key takeaways that the researchers found was that people were reporting that they were really getting approximately, they're at the lower end, but they're getting approximately the appropriate number of hours of sleep each day. So these athletes were attentive to that sleep, but the quality of that sleep was on average reported as poor. So while they're getting the appropriate amount of sleep, the quality of that and getting into that stage 3 and stage 4 is just not happening consistently for those athletes. So that meant that with that shorter sleep duration and poor sleep quality, that fatigue and those shorter sleep durations were definitely associated with stress. They were also correlated with depression and anxiety. Your level of social support was also a bit of a predictor, or at least was a correlational predictor. And the authors stated from the current findings, it's clear that sleep plays an important role in mental health among student athletes and should be considered as a potentially modifiable factor for poor mental health for this population. So as we look at the rise in prevalence of depression and anxiety and some of those other challenges, sleep's a really important component to that. Um, so we really are recognizing that stress impacts your sleep and sleep impacts your stress. So you have this continuous cycle, this what they refer to as a bidirectional relationship going on between the two. So we will talk in class next time about trying to improve our own and trying to set goals for improving our own sleep quality. And we'll also be tracking and paying attention to our sleep practices. So I will make sure that we're aware of that lab. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm looking forward to seeing you again, and I'm here to help you. Have a good rest of the day.